There's a specific kind of silence that doesn't come from giving up. It comes from arriving. And the person on the other side never understands the difference until it's already too late. Because for a long time, your voice was the bridge. Your words were the glue. Your explaining was the soft net under the relationship, catching every fall, absorbing every impact, translating every cold moment into something survivable. You weren't just communicating. You were stabilizing the entire dynamic. You were the one who found the language. You were the one who named what was happening. You were the one who turned confusion into sentences, pain into coherence, longing into patience. You were the one who kept returning to the same closed door with a new key, because part of you believed that if you could just find the right words, the right timing, the right tone, the right softness, you could unlock a human response from someone who kept choosing distance as their default. And at first, it looked like love. It looked like maturity. It looked like emotional intelligence. But there was another truth underneath it. A truth you didn't want to admit, because it would have made the whole story collapse. The truth was that your explaining was doing the work that should have been shared. It was compensating for their avoidance. It was carrying their lack of self-awareness. It was filling the gap where accountability should have been. It was keeping you connected to someone who could only stay close as long as you stayed small enough not to overwhelm them with your reality. And you stayed small for longer than you should have. Not because you didn't know you deserved more, but because you kept hoping the next version of you would finally be easy enough to keep. You tried clarity. You tried gentleness. You tried humor. You tried calm. You tried not asking. You tried asking. You tried letting it go. You tried bringing it back. You tried being the kind of person who doesn't need much. You tried being the kind of person who only needs the bare minimum. And still, the bare minimum felt like a negotiation. Still, being met emotionally felt like a rare event. Still, the moments you were held felt like exceptions, not a home. And that's how this happens. You don't stop explaining because you stop loving. You stop explaining because you finally see that love cannot survive on one person's translations forever. You stop explaining when you realize you've been trying to teach someone how to treat you like a human being, and they keep failing the lesson not because the lesson is complex, but because they don't want to feel what it would require them to feel. The night you became done explaining yourself wasn't necessarily dramatic. It didn't need a speech. It didn't need a fight. It didn't need you to announce your departure with fireworks. It was quieter than that. It was a moment inside you where something went still. The part of you that used to rush to fix the misunderstanding didn't move. The part of you that used to craft paragraphs to make your pain sound reasonable went silent. The part of you that used to soften your needs so they wouldn't feel attacked stopped editing. It wasn't bitterness. It was clarity. It wasn't revenge. It was self-respect. It wasn't a tantrum. It was fatigue turning into wisdom. Because there's a certain kind of exhaustion that is sacred. It's the exhaustion that happens when your nervous system finally understands what your heart has been denying. You can't explain your way into being valued. You can't communicate your way into someone's capacity. You can't be so patient that it becomes intimacy. And when you finally accept that, you don't become cold. You become unavailable for confusion. You become unavailable for the role you were assigned without consent, The role of translator, repairer, emotional manager, and permanent source of calm for someone who never learned how to soothe themselves without making you responsible for their discomfort. This is why they realized too late. Because while you were explaining, you were also protecting them from consequences. Your explanations did two things at once. They were requests for change, and they were a cushion. They made everything softer. They made every rupture less final. They gave the relationship a chance to keep existing even when the emotional foundation wasn't there. Every time you explained, you reopened the possibility of repair. Even if they didn't repair. Even if they ignored you. The fact that you were still trying told them something. It told them you were still reachable. It told them the door was still unlocked. It told them that your love was still willing to negotiate. And a lot of emotionally avoidant or emotionally immature people don't respond to words the way you do. They respond to access. They respond to the feeling of having you. They respond to the comfort of knowing you're still there. While you were explaining, they didn't have to change because nothing was truly at stake. They could delay, deflect, disappear for a while, return with a half apology, and you would do what you always did. You would make it make sense. You would translate their absence into stress, their inconsistency into fear, their coldness into overwhelm, their lack of accountability into not knowing how, their distance into needing space. And sometimes those translations were compassionate and accurate, but sometimes they were just you saving the story because you didn't want to accept the simplest truth. The simplest truth was that they were choosing themselves at your expense. They were choosing comfort over connection. They were choosing avoidance over intimacy. They were choosing a version of you that asked for nothing and expected less. And your explaining kept giving them the luxury of not having to face that. So their realization came late because the consequence came late. The day you stopped explaining was the day the cushion was removed, and suddenly, they felt impact. Not because your words finally landed, but because your silence did. Not because they suddenly became emotionally fluent, but because their environment changed. You changed. You stopped being the place they could come back to without earning it. You stopped being the soft landing. You stopped being the emotional customer service line open 24/7. You stopped being the one who kept the dynamic alive with your effort. And without your effort, the relationship didn't feel stable anymore. It felt like what it actually was. It felt like a person who had been relying on you to do the work, finally realizing that the work is not optional when the person who was doing it walks away. But the real reason it hit them late is even deeper. They didn't realize you were leaving because you didn't leave in one day. You left in 1,000 small moments where you reached out and weren't met. You left in every conversation where you had to beg for basic empathy. You left in every time you had to make your needs smaller to keep the peace. You left in every time you were told you were too sensitive, too intense, too much, when in reality, you were just asking for presence. You left in every time your intuition said, "This is not safe," and you argued back because you wanted it to be safe. You left in every time you cried quietly and still showed up the next morning like nothing happened. You left in every time you swallowed your truth because it would have made them uncomfortable. You left in every time you explained and watched their eyes glaze over. You left in every time you tried to connect and they turned it into a problem you were creating. By the time you stopped explaining, you were already gone. You were just still physically present enough for them to believe you'd remain accessible. And that's what makes the late realization so brutal. They think the silence is a phase. They think you'll come back with another paragraph. They think you're just upset. They think they can wait you out because they're used to your love being renewable. They're used to your patience refilling itself. They're used to you being the kind of person who says, "I just want to understand you. I just want us to be okay. I just want to talk." They don't realize that the moment you stop saying those things, you're not building toward another conversation. You're building toward an ending. And when the ending finally becomes visible to them, it feels sudden. It feels like you changed overnight. It feels like you became cold. It feels like you flipped a switch. But you didn't flip a switch. You ran out of oxygen. You stopped feeding a dynamic that was starving you. You stopped trying to make a half love feel whole. You stopped explaining because your soul finally refused to keep auditioning for basic care. And that's the point where the power shifts. Because as long as you were explaining, they could keep you in debate. They could keep you in negotiation. They could keep you in the role of persuader. They could twist your words, reduce your feelings, reframe the issue as your overthinking, your neediness, your drama. They could make the relationship feel like a courtroom where they were the judge and you were presenting evidence of your own humanity, hoping for a verdict of compassion. Explaining keeps you in court. Silence walks you out. And when you walk out, they lose the role of deciding whether your feelings are reasonable. They lose the ability to manage you through confusion. They lose the ability to keep you hooked by never giving a clear answer. Because your silence is clarity. Your silence says, "I'm not debating my worth anymore." Your silence says, "I'm not negotiating for the basics anymore." Your silence says, "I'm not available for someone who needs me to shrink so they can feel safe." And that kind of silence is frightening to someone who benefited from your emotional labor. Not because you were controlling, but because you were consistent. You were the stable one. You were the one who brought warmth. You were the one who kept returning. Your presence was predictable, even when theirs wasn't. And predictability is comfort. So when your predictability disappears, they feel the loss in a way your words could never create. This is why some people only realize what they had when it's no longer guaranteed. They weren't paying attention to the quality of your love. They were paying attention to the availability of it. They weren't honoring you. They were using you as emotional infrastructure. And once the infrastructure is gone, the whole system collapses. Now, the phrase, "done explaining yourself," sounds simple, but it carries an entire history. It carries every time you tried to bring up something important and they made it about your tone. It carries every time you said, "I feel hurt," and they said, "You're too much." It carries every time you asked for reassurance and they acted like you were asking for oxygen on a planet with no air. It carries every time you tried to set a boundary and they responded with silence or punishment or withdrawal. It carries every time you tried to clarify the relationship and they gave you ambiguity because ambiguity kept their options open. It carries every time you tried to talk about the future and they made it feel like you were asking for a contract. It carries every time you tried to be seen and you were treated like a problem. So when you stopped explaining, it wasn't just about one argument. It was about your identity. It was the part of you that kept trying to be understandable Finally realizing you do not need to be more understandable. You need to be more protected. The moment you stop explaining is the moment you stop trying to be digestible. You stop cutting yourself into smaller pieces so someone can swallow you without choking. You stop translating your truth into softer language so it can pass through their defenses. You stop being the emotional diplomat in a relationship where your emotional citizenship was never recognized. And at night, when everything is quieter and your mind tries to bring them back, it's important to remember that your silence is not an accident. It's not you being dramatic. It's not you trying to punish. It is your nervous system drawing a line between love and self-abandonment. Because you can love someone and still recognize that the way they love you is unsafe. You can miss someone and still know that the dynamic required too much of you. You can grieve and still choose yourself. And that's what makes this kind of night heavy. It's not just heartbreak. It's the death of a role you played for too long. The death of the version of you who believed that if you could just explain better, you could finally be met. When they realized too late, what they were realizing was not just that you were gone. They were realizing what your presence had been doing for them. They were realizing how much you carried. They were realizing how many chances you gave. They were realizing how many times you could have left and didn't. And that realization can feel like panic. It can feel like regret. It can feel like sudden obsession. It can feel like them reaching out with new words, softer words, words they never used before. They might say, "I miss you." They might say, "I didn't realize." They might say, "Can we talk?" They might say, "You're different." They might say, "What happened to you?" They might even apologize in a way that sounds almost right. But here's the truth you need at night. The truth that protects you from being pulled back into the loop. Realization is a moment. Transformation is a pattern. Realization can be triggered by loss. Transformation requires character. So when they realize too late, it doesn't automatically mean they're ready. It means they finally feel the consequence of not being ready. And consequences can make anyone emotional. Consequences can make anyone nostalgic. Consequences can make anyone reach. But reaching is not the same as changing. And you didn't stop explaining yourself because you wanted to be chased. You stopped explaining because you were tired of chasing. You were tired of teaching. You were tired of being the only one brave enough to tell the truth out loud. You were tired of feeling like closeness depended on your performance. You were tired of being the one who had to stay calm while your heart was breaking. You were tired of carrying a relationship on your back while pretending it was shared. The reason this kind of dynamic haunts the person who lost you is because it's not the kind of loss that can be blamed on bad luck. It's not the kind of loss that can be shrugged off as wrong timing. It's the kind of loss that whispers, "You had it, and you didn't hold it." You were given a rare kind of person, and you treated them like they were replaceable. You were loved in a way that was generous and intelligent and patient, and instead of meeting it, you managed it. You treated it like something that would always be there. And when you stop explaining, you stop being manageable. You become final. They can't negotiate your absence the way they negotiated your needs. They can't reduce your silence into a misunderstanding. They can't twist it. Silence is too clean. Silence is too undeniable. And that's why, in their mind, it replays. They start hearing your old words with new ears. The things you said months ago that they dismissed suddenly sound like prophecy. The boundaries you tried to set that they ignored suddenly feel like warnings. The moments you went quiet before suddenly feel like the first crack. They start noticing the pattern of your patience. They start remembering the look on your face when you were trying not to cry. They start remembering how you kept showing up even when they didn't deserve it. And the worst part is that they realize you didn't leave because you stopped caring. You left because you started caring about yourself. And that kind of leaving is irreversible. Not always because you hate them, but because your soul remembers what it cost you to stay. Now, let's talk about the psychology of the too late part, because it matters for your closure. People who benefit from your explaining often confuse it with weakness. They think your willingness to talk means you'll tolerate anything. They mistake your emotional depth for dependency. They see your effort as proof that you need them. And because they think you need them, they treat you like an option. They delay. They take you for granted. They assume you'll be there when they're ready. But what they don't understand is that the most devoted people are often the ones who leave the most cleanly. Because they don't leave impulsively. They don't leave after one bad day. They leave after they've tried every door. They leave after they've exhausted every language. They leave after they've given so many chances that leaving is no longer a threat. It's a fact. And once they leave, they don't keep coming back in circles because they already did the circles while they were still there. Your explaining was you doing the circles. Your silence is you finally stepping out of them. That's why it's too late. They expected the kind of person who leaves loudly and comes back easily. They didn't realize you were the kind of person who stays quietly until you can't, and then leaves with dignity. And dignity is terrifying to someone who thought they could manage you with ambiguity. When you were explaining, you were still emotionally available. Even if you were angry, you were available. Even if you were hurt, you were available. Even if you were crying, you were available. Emotional availability is still access. It still feeds the bond. It still gives them a way back. But when you're done explaining, you're not angry enough to be baited, and you're not hopeful enough to be hooked. You become calm. And calm is the state that cannot be manipulated by delayed texts and vague apologies. Calm is the state that says, I see you clearly now. Calm is the state that says, I don't need you to agree with me for me to leave. Calm is the state that says, I'm not here to convince you anymore. Calm is the state that says, I am not an argument. And when you become that calm, it creates a kind of grief in them, because they can feel that you're no longer trying to win. You're no longer trying to be chosen. You're no longer trying to be understood. You're no longer trying to be enough. You already are. And they feel that shift like a door closing. Now, this video is not about making you feel powerful in a shallow way. It's about honoring the depth of what you survived. Because being the person who always explains is a lonely role. You carry everyone's emotions. You carry everyone's misunderstandings. You carry the responsibility of keeping it healthy. You become the container. And when you're done, the container breaks, and you finally feel how much you were holding. That can be devastating, because you realize that while you were building a bridge, they were building an exit. While you were trying to create intimacy, they were trying to keep distance without losing benefits. While you were turning toward them, they were turning away and calling it space. And part of you might feel foolish for not seeing it sooner. But don't shame yourself. You didn't stay because you were stupid. You stayed because you loved. And love is not stupidity. Love is courage. The only mistake was treating someone else's capacity as your responsibility. The only mistake was believing that your effort could substitute their willingness. And now you know. And knowing changes you. When you stop explaining yourself, you also stop needing them to understand. This is the quiet miracle. Because the deepest trap is wanting to be understood by someone who has no language for you. If someone cannot sit with your feelings without making them a problem, they do not have the equipment to understand you. If someone hears your pain and responds with defensiveness, they do not have the equipment. If someone treats your needs as demands, they do not have the equipment. And you can't educate someone into emotional maturity if they don't want to grow. So you release the desire to be understood by them. You stop looking for the moment where they finally look you in the eyes and say, "I get it." Because you realize that "I get it" doesn't heal you if it comes after months of neglect. "I get it" doesn't repair the way you had to shrink. "I get it" doesn't return the dignity you lost begging for the basics. It's too late. Not because you're cruel, because you've already paid too much. Their late understanding cannot refund your time. It cannot refund your energy. It cannot refund the version of you that disappeared trying to be loved correctly. And when you accept that, you become free. You stop trying to extract a clean ending from someone who thrived in mess. You stop trying to get closure from someone who used confusion as control. You stop trying to make your pain legible to someone who benefited from misreading you. And that's why they realize too late. Because the moment you stop explaining is the moment you stop being available for their narrative. You stop being available for the story where you're too sensitive and they're just busy. You stop being available for the story where you're overthinking and they're simple. You stop being available for the story where you're asking for too much and they're doing their best. You stop being available for the story where you're the problem for wanting what any healthy person would want. You step out of that story. And when you step out, their story collapses. And when their story collapses, they finally have to face the part they've been avoiding, the part that says, "I didn't show up. I didn't protect them. I didn't honor what they gave me. I let someone rare feel alone next to me." And that is a hard mirror. That mirror is what they were running from the whole time. And you, by stopping your explanations, force the mirror into the room without saying a word. This is why your quiet is so loud. Now, you might be wondering why it matters that they realize too late if you're already done. Because part of you still wants justice. Not revenge, justice. You want the truth to be seen. You want the reality to be acknowledged. You want to know that you weren't imagining it, that you weren't crazy, that you weren't too much. You want to know that your love mattered. And here is the calmest, most haunting truth. If they realized too late, it means your presence had value they couldn't recognize while it was free. The late realization is evidence that you were not easily replaceable. Not because you were perfect, but because you were genuine. Because you brought something rare, a level of emotional truth that many people never experience. You brought devotion without games. You brought clarity. You brought patience. You brought a willingness to repair. And they treated that like it would never end. When it ended, their nervous system felt the absence like losing a limb they didn't appreciate while it was attached. But here's the boundary you must keep. Their realization is not your responsibility to soothe. If they realize too late, they may reach out seeking relief. They may want you to reassure them that they're not a bad person. They may want you to soften the consequence. They may want you to explain again, this time in a way that makes them feel forgiven without changing.
That's the old dynamic trying to resurrect itself. That's them trying to put you back into the role of emotional caretaker, even in your absence. And that's where your new self-worth lives. It lives in your refusal to re-enter the role. It lives in your ability to let them feel what they created without rushing to fix it. Not because you're cruel, but because you finally understand that fixing it is what kept you trapped. Fixing it was how you stayed. Fixing it was how you kept the bond alive at your expense. And you are done paying. At night, this can feel like grief, because you might still love the version of them you hoped for. You might still remember the moments when they were sweet. You might still feel the ache of what could have been. And it's important to name that the grief is not proof you should go back. Grief is proof you cared. Grief is proof you invested. Grief is proof you had a heart. But you can have a heart and still be done. You can be tender and still be final. You can miss someone and still refuse the dynamic that made you disappear. That's the adulthood of love. That's what so many people never learn. They think love means endless tolerance, but love without self-respect becomes self-harm. And you're not doing that anymore. So let's go deeper into what they actually realized. They realized that you were the one who made the relationship feel human. You were the one who brought meaning. You were the one who noticed. You were the one who remembered. You were the one who asked, "How are you really?" You were the one who made space. You were the one who stayed curious. You were the one who tried to understand their world. You were the one who didn't want to win. You wanted to connect. And when you stopped explaining, they lost that atmosphere. They lost the warmth that made their coldness survivable. They lost the softness that made their avoidance feel like not a big deal. They lost the person who translated their distance into something forgiving. And without that, their distance became what it always was. It became abandonment. It became disrespect. It became indifference. It became the thing they didn't want to name because naming it would have required them to change. And that's when the regret begins. Regret is not always love. Sometimes it's ego. Sometimes it's discomfort. Sometimes it's fear of losing access. Sometimes it's the shock of being replaced in someone's mind. But sometimes, yes, it's love waking up too late. Love that was dormant because it was too comfortable. Love that didn't have to work because you were working. Love that didn't have to show up
because you were showing up. Love that didn't have to be brave because you were brave. And when that kind of love wakes up, it doesn't wake up gently. It wakes up with panic. It wakes up with urgency. It wakes up with messages that come out of nowhere, with sudden tenderness, with late-night thoughts, with remembering. And if you were addicted to hope, that is exactly the moment you'd go back. Because it feels like everything you wanted. It feels like proof. It feels like destiny. But the night truth is this: late love is not always reliable love. Late realization is not the same as consistent presence. A person can miss you deeply and still be incapable of meeting you. A person can regret losing you and still not do the work. A person can feel lonely without you and still return to avoidance once they feel secure again. So you don't judge their feelings. You just stop building your life on them. You stop letting their emotional weather decide your future. You become loyal to your experience. And your experience was that you were lonely with them. Your experience was that you had to explain yourself to be treated with basic care. Your experience was that you had to manage the relationship while they managed their discomfort. And you are done. The phrase "done explaining yourself" also means something else that is even more haunting. It means you stopped needing them to see you. And that is the deepest loss for someone who took you for granted. Because while you were explaining, you were still seeking their gaze. You were still seeking their recognition. You were still hoping to be chosen. Your eyes were still turned toward them. When you stop explaining, your eyes turn away. You stop orienting your identity around their perception. You stop asking them to confirm your reality. You stop needing their approval. And that is when they truly lose you. Not when you block them, not when you date someone else, not when you post something. They lose you when they can feel that you no longer want to be seen by them. Because being seen by them used to matter to you. It used to shape you. And now it doesn't.
That shift is devastating because it reveals what they never wanted to admit. They had power because you gave it. They had influence because you cared. They could hurt you because you were open. And now you're not open to them in the same way. And they feel that like a death, because in a way, it is. It's the death of access to your heart. And access to your heart was a privilege they didn't protect. There's a quiet cruelty in emotional immaturity. Not always intentional, but real. It's the cruelty of letting someone pour into you while you give them just enough to keep them pouring. It's the cruelty of taking the benefits of love without the responsibility of loving. It's the cruelty of enjoying someone's loyalty while making them feel ashamed for needing you. It's the cruelty of receiving devotion and responding with distance. And when you stop explaining, you expose that cruelty without saying the word. You simply remove yourself from it. And removal is the only language some people understand. Because while you were explaining, they could pretend you were the problem. They could reduce you into a category: needy, dramatic, intense, insecure, whatever label made them feel less accountable. But when you stop explaining, the labels don't work anymore. You're not arguing. You're not pleading. You're not reacting. You're just gone. And when you're gone, the only thing left is their behavior. The only thing left is their choices. The only thing left is the pattern. And the pattern is loud. The pattern is undeniable. The pattern says, You lost someone because you refused to grow. And that is a hard thing to live with. Now, let's bring it back to you, because this isn't really about their realization. This is about your return. The night you became done explaining yourself was the night you reclaimed your life. Because explaining keeps you tethered. Explaining keeps you emotionally engaged. Explaining keeps you pouring energy into someone who isn't reciprocating. Explaining keeps you hoping. And hope can be beautiful, but in the wrong relationship, hope becomes a chain. So when you stop explaining, you break the chain. You stop making your peace dependent on their understanding. You stop making your worth dependent on their response. You stop making your future dependent on their readiness. You stop making your nervous system wait for crumbs. And that is a transformation. It's not loud. It's not performative. It's internal. And internal transformations are the ones that stick. They change your taste. They change what you can tolerate. They change what feels normal. You start noticing that you can't unsee what you saw. You can't unknow the loneliness. You can't unknow the way your body braced. You can't unknow the way you had to strategize to be heard. And once you can't unknow it, you can't go back to pretending it's fine. That's why your silence is so final. Because it's not just silence. It's a new identity. It's you becoming someone who doesn't negotiate for the basics. It's you becoming someone who doesn't teach people how to treat you. It's you becoming someone who doesn't keep explaining your humanity to someone committed to misunderstanding it. And that identity shift is what makes them realize too late. Because they were dealing with the old you. The you who would always come back with more clarity. They were dealing with the you who would always soften the consequence. They were dealing with the you who would always repair. And then suddenly, the old you is gone. The new you is quiet. The new you is steady. The new you is no longer available for the cycle. And the cycle depends on your participation. Without you, the cycle dies. That's why their panic can feel intense, because it's not just losing you, it's losing the system that kept them comfortable. If you've ever wondered why they suddenly show emotion when you're leaving, this is why. Your leaving is the first time they have to feel something without you buffering it. Your leaving is the first time they have to sit with the emptiness they created. Your leaving is the first time they have to face themselves. And the thing about facing yourself is that it's not optional forever. Eventually, it catches you, either through loneliness or regret or the repetition of the same story with different people. When you stop explaining yourself, you often become the moment someone meets the consequence of their pattern. And even if they never admit it, even if they never apologize properly, even if they move on outwardly, something changes inside them. Because they experienced losing someone who was trying.
And being lost by someone who was trying is different. It's not the same as being left by someone who didn't care. It's not the same as being ghosted by someone who was casual. It's not the same as a fling ending. It's the loss of someone who gave them real access, real patience, real devotion, and they didn't hold it. That's why it's haunting. That's why it sticks. That's why it can echo for years. Because the mind can forget a lot of things, but it doesn't easily forget the moment it was given something pure and treated it cheaply. Now, I want you to hold this with tenderness. You don't have to hate them to be done. You don't have to prove anything. You don't have to perform strength. You don't have to announce your boundaries. You don't have to explain why you stopped explaining. The most powerful thing you can do is let your absence speak. Not as a tactic, as a truth. Your absence is the natural outcome of being ignored. Your silence is the natural outcome of being minimized. Your withdrawal is the natural outcome of carrying the relationship alone. And you don't owe anyone an essay about why you stopped bleeding. There's a moment you may recognize in yourself, a moment where you realize you've been talking to a wall. And the wall isn't cruel, it's just a wall. It can't hug you, it can't respond, it can't grow, it can't turn toward you. It can only be what it is. And for a long time, you kept speaking because you wanted to believe the wall was a door. You wanted to believe that if you knocked the right way, it would open. But eventually, you touch it, and you feel the cold truth. It's not a door. It's a wall. And at that point, you don't scream at the wall. You don't beg the wall. You don't explain to the wall why it should become a door. You simply turn around and walk away. That's what done explaining yourself is. It's you finally accepting what you've been interacting with. And that acceptance is closure. It's not the closure you wanted, but it's the closure that sets you free. The closure that says, I will no longer try to make an unavailable person available. I will no longer present my heart for evaluation. I will no longer compete with someone's comfort. I will no longer make myself smaller so someone else can stay the same. I will no longer confuse love with labor. And at night, when you're tempted to reopen the door because you miss them, remember that missing is not a compass. Missing is a symptom of attachment. Attachment can form even in starvation. Attachment can bond you to inconsistency. Attachment can make you crave the person who made you anxious because the anxiety became familiar. But your self-respect is a deeper compass. Your self-respect remembers what it cost. Your self-respect remembers the nights you cried after trying to be understood. Your self-respect remembers the way your body felt when you were waiting for a response. Your self-respect remembers the loneliness. Your self-respect remembers the shrinking. Your self-respect remembers the version of you that disappeared to keep them comfortable. And your self-respect says, never again. Not because you're punishing them, because you're protecting you. This is the part that is so hard for people who are used to you explaining. They want you to make it softer. They want you to make it understandable. They want you to give them a reason they can accept. They want you to frame it in a way that doesn't make them feel like they lost something important. They want you to take responsibility for their feelings about losing you. But the new you doesn't do that. The new you does not manage the emotional aftermath for someone who didn't manage the relationship while you were in it. The new you does not soothe the person who caused the wound. The new you does not give closure to the person who refused to give you clarity. The new you does not hand over your dignity in exchange for a late conversation. The new you simply remains true. And truth is not always loud. Truth can be quiet. Truth can be a door that doesn't open again. Truth can be no response. Truth can be a life that moves forward. Truth can be you choosing yourself without explanation. And that is why they realized too late. Because they thought your love was infinite. They thought your patience was permanent. They thought your softness would always cover the sharp edges of their avoidance. They thought you would keep explaining because you always did. They thought wrong. They didn't understand that your explaining was the last stage before your silence. They didn't understand that the person who explains the most is often the person who is closest to leaving, because explaining is effort, and effort has a limit. And when that limit is reached, it doesn't explode, it evaporates. You don't fight, you don't beg, you don't chase. You just stop. And when you stop, they finally feel the void where your effort used to be. They finally feel the coldness of their own distance. They finally feel the emptiness of a relationship without your emotional labor. They finally feel what you felt for months. And that is the late realization. It is them waking up inside the loneliness they created. It is them finally hearing the silence they kept giving you. It is them finally understanding, not through empathy, but through consequence. And if that sounds harsh, it's only because reality is harsh when it's been avoided for too long. Now, let's speak to the part of you that still wonders, what if I had explained one more time? What if I had said it differently? What if I had been calmer? What if I had waited? What if I had been less intense? That part of you is not stupid. That part of you is loyal. That part of you wants to believe that love could have been enough. But here is the clean truth. You did explain. You explained in words. You explained in tears. You explained in patience. You explained in silence. You explained in forgiveness. You explained in how many chances you gave. The problem was never that you didn't explain. The problem was that you were explaining to someone who did not want to receive. Someone who benefited from not receiving. Someone who stayed comfortable by staying unclear. Someone who avoided accountability by turning your needs into an inconvenience. Someone who could only love you as long as love didn't require them to grow. And you can't love someone into growth if they don't choose it. So no, one more explanation wouldn't have saved it. It might have extended it. It might have given you another loop. It might have given them another cushion. But it wouldn't have healed the foundation. Foundations are built by two people, and you were building alone. So if tonight you feel the heaviness of that, let it be what it is. Not shame, not regret. Grief. Grief for what you wanted. Grief for what you deserved. Grief for what you tried to create. Grief for the version of you that kept hoping. Grief for the tenderness you offered. And grief is not weakness. Grief is evidence of depth. Grief is evidence of love. And the fact that you can grieve and still be done is the most powerful kind of strength. Because it means you're not leaving from hatred. You're leaving from truth. You're leaving from self-respect. You're leaving from the quiet knowing that love should not require you to disappear. The night you stopped explaining yourself is the night you stopped disappearing. And whether they realized it or not, whether they admit it or not, whether they come back or not, something has already changed. You have changed. You have crossed a line inside yourself where you can no longer pretend. You can no longer unsee. You can no longer beg for the basics. You can no longer contort your heart into something smaller just to keep someone near. You have become the person who chooses. And that is the person you were always becoming through every painful conversation, every unanswered message, every moment you tried and weren't met. Your silence is not emptiness. Your silence is yourself returning. Your silence is your dignity. Your silence is your life beginning again. Welcome to Attachment Alchemy Lab. You're safe here.